My pleasure to welcome our keynote speaker for today, Dr. Robin Isserles, who is the author of The Costs of Completion, which is one of our books that we have opted to read as a campus community this year. Robin is a third-generation CUNY student and currently works as a professor in that system. And my sense is that she has a lifelong dedication to being a community college instructor and always seeking out ways to improve herself and to improve the systems in which we work. She's got 20 years of teaching and researching in the community college context. She spent time analyzing enrollment patterns. She's interviewed students. I know that sometimes we wonder what happens to our students that have withdrawn from our classes. And Robin has worked tirelessly to try to answer those questions, both for herself, and I think that some of those answers are also things that we will benefit from hearing. She argues for centering student sensibilities or student sensibility and cultivating a sense of belonging for students, helping them to think about having an identity as a college student or as a City College of San Francisco student. And these are things that we have been talking about, but how we actually take those words and put them to action, I think, is where I'd love for our campus community to have more dialogue. The last thing I'll say is that Robin makes a powerful argument, I think, that we should hear and invites us to participate in that dialogue. I simultaneously think that Robin does a lot of reflection about her own journey and has a lot of humility about that. And to me, that reflection and humility are key components to what we want to hold on to on a day of professional development, where we're asked to envision how we individually could be better and how we might work together to make our institution better. And so with that, let me not take any more time, and please help me give a warm welcome to our keynote speaker today, Dr. Robin Isserles.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? It is a pleasure to be here. This is my first trip to CCSF. Not my first trip to San Francisco, but it's been 10 years, and it's really nice to be back. First, I do want to thank Nathan and William and Elena and everyone I worked with, the whole committee, for not only adopting my book for this spring, but for inviting me to be here to talk about some of what I found, some of what I've been thinking about over my course of time at a community college. I started teaching at a community college when I was in my second year of grad school, getting my PhD in sociology. I had never taught before, call it baptism by fire. I had no pedagogical development. I sat in on a colleague's class for a summer before I started teaching, and there I was teaching an evening class of Introduction to Sociology, and I fell in love with teaching at the community college. I fell in love with teaching community college students. I did a lot of thinking about my own teaching over the years, and I was involved in some research, and that's what culminated in this book. So for today, I want to give you a sense of the inspiration behind the book, some of the critiques that I'm putting forward, which I think is important for us to be thinking about as we think about improving ourselves as people who meet with students, whether in our classrooms or in our offices, and really, I think through some of the hard questions that we don't often get an opportunity to think about. So that's what I'd like to do. So what do I mean by the costs of completion? And let me just say at the outset, I'm not saying we don't care or we shouldn't care about getting students to complete college at all. But I was inspired to write this book because I was becoming more and more frustrated with the ways in which student success was being narrowly defined, and the harm that I saw that this was doing to my students who were trying to juggle very busy lives outside the classroom and trying to keep up with being pushed to take more and more credits because of a reading of some of the research that suggested that if they were not enrolled full-time, they were more likely not to finish at all. And I just thought that so much of this push was really misguided for the students that I knew in my class. And I suspected that a lot of the people that were pushing this more and more and more really didn't have a good idea about who our students are. And we do. We work with these students. We know these students. They come to our office hours. I will say, I call them student hours now, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So when I say student hours, I mean office hours. I actually think it resonates better with students to call them student hours. They know it's for them. So I've adopted that language. But we know these students as much as possible, and certainly more than what a lot of people who were making these decisions to suggest that we push students to take more and more credits and get them to full-time and get them to do college year-round were not really attuned to. And so I wanted to write a book that really describes some of what I've learned over now close to 30 years, if you include my time as a part-time instructor while in graduate school, and full-time. I was also inspired because I was constantly sitting in meetings and just hearing a kind of corporatist language that just didn't sit well for me. We were starting to think of ourselves as content providers. And I don't know if this language is out here on the West Coast. It certainly is on the East Coast. Following best practices, reporting to administrators concerned with enrollment management and ROIs, and having our classrooms also kind of infected with this language as students themselves were internalizing this message that they were consumers of their education. And from that outset, I thought, this is the wrong path. This is not why so many of us got into teaching higher ed. They are more than return on investments. And I know we have to be conscious of budgets, but in our classrooms, they are not investments in that sense. They're not widgets. They are human people who want more for their lives and for their families, and we want to honor that. And so that was another kind of impetus for the book. Wendy Brown, the political theorist, has coined this process, this adoption of this corporatist language, this kind of neoliberal impulse, as the neoliberal ascendancy. And what I do in the book is I discuss this and its many manifestations as it's hit the community college context. So in each chapter of the book, I demonstrate a different yet interrelated piece of the college completion project as an artifact of this neoliberal thinking. It's made for many of us, it's made it very difficult for so many of us to even envision other alternative possibilities when the language becomes so framed around a certain way of thinking about student success. And, there are things to be concerned about, right? We do have students who withdraw and we don't know where they go. And we have students who stop out and come back and, pivot between full-time and part-time. So we want to be concerned by these trends and understand them in a deeper way. But the ways in which community colleges were being redesigned, in my estimation, was merely about getting them through. And I think that's another way in which students have internalized this. I just want to get through. And what does that do to the quality of what we're hoping to offer them in our classrooms of, thinking about them as intellectually capable of doing college work and of growing and flourishing just like we would at any other college? And why is that a different name in the community college? So these were some of the other questions that I was thinking about. So I also wanted to shed some light on some of the contradictions that have emerged, but have been kind of shoved to the margins. I think the most important of these won't be a surprise to you, that as our higher education has democratized and as we've invited more and more people in who we used to call non-traditional, we've had severe erosion of state and city and budgets and allocations towards higher ed. Those two things have happened at the same time throughout the country, not just here in California. Certainly in New York, that is the case as well. And that, as we know, has unleashed a whole host of consequences. Larger class sizes, an over-reliance on contingent faculty and staff, fewer learning resources, labs, libraries, counseling services. It was so delightful to hear some of the expansion that's happening at CCSF. That's very exciting. I've spoken to many community colleges who are not in that place and who are suffering from a diminishment of those kinds of resources. Other contradictions, right? Setting a graduation rate of 2 or 3 years, I think many of us in this room know that that's implausible, it's impossible, and it's not because of a desire. This is not about grit, and I do critique the whole grit narrative in chapter 6, if you're interested. I'm not gonna speak too much about that today unless you want, but our students are incredibly full of grit and determination. Every time they walk outside of where they live to come to campus, they show grit and determination. It's not that, though. It's all of these other outside structural forces that make college going so difficult for them. And pushing them to do more and more doesn't seem a way to keep them or to encourage them to come back. I do a whole analysis of the way that the data is constructed in chapter 2, and I don't want to bore everyone. I don't know how data friendly you are, but just I'll give a very brief idea of what I say in chapter 2. IPEDS, I always forget what it stands for, the Integrated Post-Secondary Education Data System. That's often the data that's used to demonstrate, right, college completion rates. It's very restrictive, and we often don't know this, right? So it considers only first-time, full-time students who graduate with an associate's degree in 3 years. Okay, so let that sink in. So for the 2010 cohort, it shows a 25% completion rate. And most of us were like, oh, of course it does. Yes, it does. There's a newer metric being adopted called the Voluntary Framework of Accountability, the VFA. I don't know, again, the data heads in the room, if you're familiar with this. This is a little bit more liberal, includes full, part-time, considers credentials, and allows a 6-year time frame, better. And that shows a 59% graduation rate, better. Still not good, still something that we should be thinking about, but there's a big difference here. I think it's incumbent upon us as faculty, as staff, to always question the data. And maybe that's just my training as a sociologist, right? What numbers are we looking at, and how are they generated when we're talking about our students and what we should be doing? Now, of course, another contradiction, right, is for higher institutions, higher ed institutions not marred by low retention and completion rates, right? The largely private, mostly inaccessible colleges that we hear a lot about in the news. College in those contexts is about a self-explorative experience, right? Full of opportunities to grow intellectually, socially. But for the rest, including the academically and economically precarious students attending public colleges, and specifically community colleges, their experience is reduced to getting through on hyperspeed. Is this in the way? I realize that. Thank you so much. Apologies. So I don't want my students to be thinking about getting through on hyperspeed and making their lives much more fraught emotionally, mentally, physically, and intellectually. I think that most of us in the community college classroom and offices want more for our students. And so again, that was the impetus behind the book. So in the first part of the book, I situate so it's on, how many have read it yet, or you're reading it for the spring, correct? Okay, great. I didn't want to repeat too much, but I'll give a kind of an outline. So I situate the community college and its purpose and its historical context, right? This is not the first time we're thinking about the purpose of a community college, its social justice mission, et cetera. But then I kind of turn my attention to what has become the dominant theory driving so much of the reform, which is called academic momentum, right? And it, you can think of like the physics principle of momentum. The earlier and the more a student is integrated academically in their college, the more likely they are to persist and graduate on time, right? It makes sense, it's intuitive, right? Of course, the original study done in the 80s was only done at bachelor granting institutions. It's unclear how the community college context got fixated on this. I think it was because of the pressures with state budget declines and completion rates and retention rates that were thought of as a concern. But if we think about this physics principle and we think about our students, it really doesn't make sense for our students, right? We can build momentum, we can build support, but that doesn't necessarily need to or have to translate into just pushing them through more and more classes, right? And very, very often, I don't know how it's done here at City College, and I'm looking forward to hearing more, at CUNY, where I teach, I'm at Borough of Manhattan Community College, one of 7 community colleges of the CUNY system. A lot of this is being pushed through online learning. So we have students trying to juggle full-time jobs or part-time jobs that are close enough to full, but under the score so they don't get the benefits. So 30 hours a week, even 25 hours a week, juggling 5 classes, doing 3 in person, and then being pushed to take 2 online. And it's a recipe for failure. And unfortunately, students internalize this as their own failure. We know that it's beyond them and outside of them, and our voice, I think, is a really important voice here to share. Now, for some students, these initiatives may be very helpful, right? It's some students who may be at 12 credits and pushed along for another 3, they may do quite well. And so we may not want to throw this out completely, but I think we want to be more thoughtful about how we are and why we are pushing students to do more and who we're pushing to do more. We do have students who are able to commit to being a full-time student, who have very few obligations, family and work, who might do very well to be supported and prodded to be taking an additional class. But for the majority of our students, I think that's not the case. And I think that we need some attention there. We also want to be careful about how we're celebrating this, right? So I will never forget, right before I went on sabbatical to write this book, my then provost of my institution put some wonderful charts on the board celebrating 5 years of improved completion rates of our students. And it was pretty significant. And then, of course, the next slide was an increase in students on academic probation. And so after the meeting, because I wanted to be respectful, I said, so I'm curious what correlation you see between these 2 things. And she looked at me with like the 3-eyed fish from the Simpsons, like she couldn't imagine that there would be a connection between these 2 things. And it was almost at that point where I'm like, I think I need to write a book because there is some disconnect here, right? Yes, we should be celebrating an improvement of completion, but if we are doing so, when we are also experiencing a pretty significant rise in the number of students who are on probation, I don't know if you have academic probation here, yes, okay, which I also think we may want to look into for a community college that's open admission, whether a probation is the right course, again, a national discussion. But to not have a sense that those 2 can be related, that we might be serving some students but might be doing much more harm to lots of other students is I think, a reason for some examination. So in the 3rd chapter, I talk a bit about, I had the opportunity, actually, I was invited to be part of a Gates-funded project looking at academic momentum among first-year students at the CUNY community colleges. And this started back in 2011. I was on the project for 2011 to 2013. My school was gracious enough to allow me to leave so that I was part of this research team, and it was really exciting. It's not often something a community college faculty gets to do. I will say that I was chosen because I had the community college street cred, if you will, because the rest of the research team did not, which is another issue I bring up in the book, that the folks who are often studying and researching and examining the community college context don't teach or work at a community college, and I do think that that allows for some of this misread and or narrowness of how and what we're learning. It was a great opportunity. It was a wonderful way to see how randomized controlled trial experiments are really, really problematic. At all counts, from recruitment to attrition in the and the fact that they're the gold standard of educational research right now, I think, is also kind of problematic. There's this underbelly of lots of problems, and again, this was just one pretty big research, but it was a lot. But I had the opportunity to interview students who are part of that program, and so a lot of that data, where I talk about the student sensibility in chapters 5 and 6. Are used in that. But, one of the issues is, as states have moved away from their funding commitments, we've had this kind of new class of, some folks are calling them edu-philanthropists, folks like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Lumina Foundation, that have kind of rushed in. And, I will say the Gates folks were lovely. They were not on our backs about what we were doing. They were happy enough to get our yearly reports. But that's, I don't think, where the issue is. The issue is that they have a particular set of agenda items that become wrapped into the research that they fund. And it's this very kind of echo chambery sort of relationship. So, we have guided pathways. Have you adopted guided pathways here? Okay, so guided pathways brought to you by the Gates Foundation through the partially Gates-funded CCRC, the Community College Research Center, because they get their money to study guided pathways and implement it from the Gates Foundation. And then you have the evaluative groups like MDRC, who are also partially funded by the Gates Foundation. So it's this very kind of tricky, a little bit scary echo chamber of all these folks, again, often divorced from the community college context, who are putting this research out that we are then supposed to be, scurrying about to implement to try to help our students succeed. Now, again, some of it there may be some valid things that we want to consider, but we also know a lot of insights from just working with students in our offices and our classrooms that sometimes defy what this research shows that should be part of the discussion. And that's one of the hopes that I have for this book. So what do I mean by student sensibility and student ready? Just looking at the time. So in the second part of the book, I introduced this concept that I'm calling the student sensibility, and I'm going to share with you where it came from. But from the outset, I wanted to move away from the deficit lens through which we often see community college students. Their weaknesses, their problems, their not being student ready. And this is too much of a thread that runs through how we think about community college students, certainly in the research world. And I did not want to contribute to that because I don't think that at all. I think quite the opposite. But we are often, we often meet with students who don't have necessarily a good handle on what it means to navigate through college. And so I wanted to develop a concept that honors that and really confronts that, but without interpreting that as a deficit, as something bad, as something wrong with them. So I coined this term, the student sensibility, and I'm really happy to hear from people how it works for you, if it does and if it doesn't. But it has its roots in Pierre Bourdieu's notion of habitus, about sort of a sense of knowing, a knowledge of how to navigate through a part of a social world. But it's more reflexive than that. A lot of the things that I find with my students is that they don't think about themselves as college students. That's not something that's been part of their family socialization, especially for first-generation college students, that they don't have family members who just kind of talk about college life in a way that I think students who are continuing generation students do, especially who are more economically and academically more comfortable. So Pierre Bourdieu's notion of habitus was important. I also draw on two sociologists, Arlie Hochschild, who studied the second shift work that women do in the home. So they work, then they come home, and then there's all this other labor that has to get done. She wrote this in the 80s. Unfortunately, there has been a little movement in equalizing this. But one of the things that she wrote about was this attunement, this thinking about how a house needs to be managed, that labor, it's not just going to the grocery and getting what you need. It's thinking about everybody's needs and how that happens. And I just thought that this idea of attunement was really helpful to think about how students are more or less attuned to what it means to go to college. And in our interviews, we heard a lot of students who, their first time on campus, it was so big, they would say, right? And these are New York City high school students very often who ended up at any one of our community colleges, and it was so big. And there was just this, not knowing what a bursar office does and what a financial aid office does. And of course they don't. They're new in college. But that's sort of what I mean by attunement, how that works. And then the other sociologist that was influential was Annette Lareau, who studied different child-rearing practices of different class-based family systems. And one of her findings was that the children that she interviewed with their families who were from more working class families didn't have a sense that they were entitled to advocate for themselves, right? That they're reared by parents mostly who don't have, dominant positions in their own work history, that they report to other people. And this translates into a kind of, you just take an institution at its word, and you don't have a sense that you could and should advocate for yourself. So I was finding that for a lot of the students that I was teaching and advising, they were often, especially early on, lacking some attunement in how a college works, or didn't quite have that developed yet, and an advocacy for themselves, that they didn't know that they should push or they should question a response from a financial aid officer, right? Or when they were told they had to take a remedial class, but they took an AP English class, and they didn't know that they could advocate for themselves. And I think that's part of what I was trying to also articulate with the student sensibility. But I also wanted to flesh it out. I didn't want it only to come from a kind of world of sociology. So there were a lot of other influential thinkers. Some of them I hope you've come across. But the ideas of belonging, identity formation, what fears and insecurities students bring with them into especially a community college classroom, because they bring a lot. Rebecca Cox's work back from 2009 called The College Fear Factor was really influential for me about thinking about all of those insecurities, academic and otherwise, that students bring with them. They are so in fear of failure that they often sabotage their own success by not handing things in because they are so fearful of what it means to get back that work being critiqued, right? So there's all kinds of other mechanisms involved in developing this attunement. So folks like Estella Ben-Simon, Rebecca Cox, Regina Delamin, Bell Hooks, Bettina Love, Laura Rendon, Victor Rios, Mike Rose, Terrell Strayhorn, and Angela Valenzuela were also influences in terms of how I wanted to think about this idea of a student sensibility. And then I read, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Tony Jack's The Privileged Poor, how elite colleges are failing disadvantaged students. Anybody? 2019. Another sociologist, up and coming, really brilliant sociologist. But he took a look at two different kinds of groups of low-income students at a private institution. Everyone is guessing what it is. I don't know what it is, and I don't actually care because it doesn't matter to me where it was. And so one group of students were those students who came from low-income communities but plucked out of those neighborhoods and sent to private high schools, very often. ABC is, I don't know if this is out here on the West Coast, but it is on the East Coast, A Better Chance. So there's these kind of scholarship programs. And then the other group were coming from low-resource neighborhoods right into a place like Harvard. I don't know what school it is again, Cornell, Harvard, whatever. And Jack's point was, despite how much rhetoric there is around equity and diversity in these institutions, that the schools themselves are set up in such a way that creates the conditions where students who are low income, often first generation, are structurally excluded, right? So closing the dining halls during spring break is a really great example. Like the students who can't afford to go home don't have a meal plan, right? That's an example. And so I tried to use his idea of this kind of institution that wants students to succeed but sets barriers in the way, creates the conditions that structurally exclude them. I tried to make that meaningful in the community college context. So where it's not dining halls that close, it's pushing students who work 40 hours a week and take their grandma to dialysis on a weekly basis to take 15 credits, even if some of them are online, and think that that's a way to succeed. So a similar kind of structural exclusion there. So in chapters 5 and 6, I mentioned I use a lot of the data that I learned from my interviews, talking a lot about students and sort of the preconditions about going into college that I think are fruitful for us to think about, right? So again, for students who don't have parents who either attended or completed college, there's often something about a family socialization around college going that isn't there. And what could our institutions do to perhaps meet those needs? So whether it's thinking about creating relationships with with public high schools in the area to help students think about themselves as college. It's not just what CCS has to offer. Right? We know it has a lot to offer, but helping students think about themselves in the college setting, which is what dual enrollment, I think, was designed to do before it's now become the answer to our enrollment issues. But to offer high school students an opportunity not just to take a class, but to think about what it means to be in college. And I think that thinking about that identity formation, right? I was always struck at BMCC where I teach when I hear from my students and say, well, I work at Best Buy and I take classes at BMCC. Even though they're at BMCC as a full-time student, they work at Best Buy, maybe part-time, maybe a little bit more, maybe that in between. But I take classes not I go to BMCC or I'm a BMCC student. And I think that difference is instructive for us. I think it reveals something about how students think about themselves as college students. And that is what I wanted to speak to as well. I think we want to, in chapter 6, so I go from the preconditions to the current conditions of students who are trying to navigate all this. We do have a lot more research now on the amount of time that students work as they go to college. I'm assuming that most of your students work and go to college. Yes, I think that's a safe assumption for most of us who work at a community college. Sarah Goldrick-Robb has done a lot about this kind of research and others as well. I think we know the quantity. We know our students work a lot. I don't think we, though, have enough of a sense of how they manage this work, with the qualitative aspects of working so much and going to school and having family obligations. So we have students who will craft a schedule where they're home in time to take their younger brother to school, they come to class, they take 3 classes, they go back, they do an internship, somehow they fit in work time, they come back to pick up their and it's like a puzzle, right? But it may not be a great way to go about taking a college class. And of course, so many of the students that I teach are also dependent upon those jobs, the week to week, when they know their schedule week to week, the just-in-time hour jobs, which I think there's now some states that are trying to legislate, make that unlawful. I don't know where we are on that, but it's very often in the service sector where they work as a barista, and from week to week they don't know what their schedule is. And I don't know about you, but whoops, that was my 30-minute. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't have been able to do college like that, right? It does not account for when our assignments are due and the ebb and flow of a semester. And so I don't think we have enough of a handle on that and knowing these kind of more qualitative experiences of being a student and working and family obligations and juggling all those. And I think when I say making college student ready, that's sort of what I mean. I think for so long, and partially related to that deficit lens, we were all about making students college ready, right? Let's make them ready for college. And I don't want to be dismissive. I'm sorry, that was a little dismissive. But I do think that a better and more generative discussion would be around how do we make our colleges more student ready? How do we meet our students where they are at? How do we support the part-time student? Because pushing them to be full-time student, clearly there's lots of newer evidence, actually. Our governor, Hochul, has now, as of fall of 2022, finally allowed for our state tuition program, our TAP, to finally be allowed to for part-time students. So before that, we had a lot of students who were just trying to eke out at least 12 credits, who really knew they couldn't do this, only so that they would be eligible for state-funded financial aid. So I'm not talking about federal funded, I'm talking about the state funded. I don't know how it works here in California. I'm be interested to learn more. But that's sort of what I mean, right? Is that if we are going to just maybe start with the assumption that some of our students are just intractably part-time, like that is the way they have to go to college. How do we make the institution more responsive to that? Do we set up a part-time academy for part-time students? Do we, what kinds of things coming from what we know about our students and the struggles that they have academically, economically, of course, with other insecurities around food and housing, which we're learning more and more and more about. How do we confront that and try to work towards creating an institution that is ready for them? And I think that that's a really important guide for us. So I wasn't going to read from my book, but I will just do one quote. Moving forward, if we are committed to a more comprehensive notion of student success, we must think much more about whether and to what extent we want to disrupt or displace the habitus and life worlds of the students we are hoping to help succeed. When our students maintain deep connections and obligations to their families, to their basic livelihoods, to their multiple roles and identities, it is imperative that we consider how the policies and reform initiatives build upon or break down these connections, and whether the institutions they attend considers and appreciates these conflicts, especially if these connections seem to contradict what we assume to be necessary to succeed academically. The tendency to reduce the definition of success to degree attainment is woefully inadequate. At a basic level, what is it that we want for these students? And so are we able to have questions, or is that, yeah, great. So I want to finish up here. I offer some ways out in the last chapter. Sociologists are really good at, I think, understanding and explaining a problem, not always so good on how do we get to the next step. So I tried my best, but I'll offer a brief kind of set of things that I also hope could encourage some discussion. I do think that we should start to think about fostering the importance of establishing meaningful connections. I don't know about you, but a lot of my students, a lot of them, especially if they're first or second generation immigrant students, I'm not here to make friends. They think of school as something they have to do, they have to work, lacking in the joy and the experience of what moves us. I mean, so many of us at some point in our lives, I think, had truly, life-transforming experiences, joyful experiences, laughter. How do we establish that in our classrooms, in our offices, bringing joy back to the learning process, but also meaningful connections that can't be done through technology? The students, they don't buy the canned messages from those software, of the early alerts. I think their eyes glaze over them. And it may be more efficient, but in practice, they I think we know this. When they feel valued, respected, and inspired and challenged, they thrive. And a CAN message from Connect to Success, which is the program we use, doesn't do that. It doesn't do that enough. I would love to see, and I don't know how to go about this, but I think we should start talking about expanding our federal work-study program to the community college. A lot of the elite schools have work-study, and they may need them, and that's great. But it's woefully inadequate at the public community college. And what a great way to keep students on campus, but to give them paid work, whether it's through the federal work-study program, through paid internships, to diminish the time that they're commuting and leaving and coming back. Much more investment in emotional and mental health services, and services that are 24-hour, 7-hour. If we're going to have a campus that offers classes on the weekends and at night, then services should be there for those students. And it may be here at CCSF. In New York, it's not enough. I would love to see some institutional mechanisms designed to specifically work on the students we lose during the semester, right? Those students who disappear on us, who stop out. How do we connect with them? Can we think about ways creatively to reach out to those students, not by canned messages on email, and they don't read email, that we have to figure out another way. The app alert, I think, is one way, and maybe texting or something, but they don't, this generation, the younger generation, they don't do email very well or very much. How do we get them, how do we tell them that we care about the fact that they're not here? We miss them in class. What's the plan? You know, things are tough now. What about a summertime return? I think we would actually support and show our students that we are meeting them by having these kind of institutional mechanisms. I don't know if your school has adopted the kind of care language, the culture of care, that's becoming a lot more pervasive on the community college campus. I have a kind of critique of that in the 7th chapter that I won't bore you with here, but my own school has adopted this, and you know, I think that it's, if you don't mind my honesty, putting lipstick on a pig, right? If we're not, you know, it's not just about caring for students, and I'm all about caring for students, but we all have to be cared for, right? And if we are still relying on exploited contingent faculty and staff who we can't give full-time jobs with decent benefits, then that's not a caring community, that's not a caring institution, and we have to take that seriously. And all of our needs and our desires should be cared about in an institution for us to be caring. Very often now what happens is that there's this use of this virtue script, right? The idealistic teacher that goes to the hospital bed of the student who was in a car accident to give them their final exam, and this becomes elevated as a culture of care. And yes, it's beautiful, but that diminishes what we do as labor. And we do. We work. This is our livelihood. My own president last year at the State of the College address said, I do want to get his. I forgot what he said, but basically, this isn't a job that we do this because we love to do it or it's our vocation, or you know. And yeah, of course, many of us really do love what we do. That's a benefit. It's a privilege, right? But that doesn't diminish the fact that we work, and our care can't be done in a way of extrapolating this idealistic version of care. So, in closing, I wrote this book because I wanted to bring more attention to what many of my colleagues from around the country were whispering in the hallways and at academic conferences about what they were seeing as wrong, the wrong direction we were taking the community college. I wanted to illuminate what the students in our classrooms and offices shared with us about their lives and how they thought of themselves as students. And that policies and initiatives designed to merely get them through without this understanding was insufficient at best and destructive at worst. The school on hyperspeed, the idea of success as completion, the goal just being about getting it done, this would not be acceptable to our wealthier continuing generation students. So why should we accept it for our students? With the current changes in enrollment patterns, and I'm so delighted to hear that you have an uptick, because that's not the case where I am, and everyone is very worried. Creating a student-ready college that offers a more meaningful and, dare I say, joyful experience has even greater urgency. So I was inspired by my years in the classroom and observing the very damaging experiences that students I taught and advised were having with this push to completion. In large part because their full lives, especially outside the classroom, were disregarded by those who were defining much too narrowly what it means for a student to succeed. These trends in higher education, especially at the community college, are the furthest things from what Bell Hooks calls creating sacred spaces of education as freedom that would allow for their intellectual and spiritual growth. And that's why I went to the classroom, because of those words and those objectives. So I wanted to write a book that honors these students, our students, their stories, and the work that so many of us do here, so we could redirect the ship of public higher ed and steer it towards a different path. So thank you.
And we do have about 5 minutes, or maybe even a little less, for questions. If anybody has a question, I would ask you to come on down here and speak into the microphone so that folks that are streaming in can hear your question. And while people maybe come on down to ask a question, I will say that we do have federal work-study money and students here, and that I think students working at our college is part of how we develop that campus community. When we have students that come to our Flex Day presentations, they are often students who are working at the college. And as we think about ways of structurally including students, I do think about giving jobs as one. I also have to give a shout out to Tessa, who is always like promoting things like at the perfect time, because we've got a grant for part-time students that I think we should all be aware of. Yeah. Could you come down, Ying? So.
All right. Have to use the microphone, please.
So the people online can hear, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for the talk. And now I don't know which way I'm facing.
I think they're all around.
They're all around. That's fine. So I read the book, and I think you mentioned that one of the underlying condition for all of our problems is the underfunding of higher ed. And I don't know how much you know about the student-centered funding formula in California. In my opinion, it's very punitive. And you have done a lot of analysis, in New York. I'm so sorry. I was holding the microphone without using the microphone. I just realized that. Thank you for the reminder. So with the funding deficit, it's a nationwide problem, and it is an underlying problem for most of what we're facing. So I don't know if I have a real question without asking you to look into the crystal ball to see, do you see a trend, like nationwide or in different states, that situation might get any better? Because I know for our local situation, our chancellor has talked about going to Sacramento and maybe trying to advocate. Even without that, we're now in the holding harmless, but we're still facing a fiscal crisis in a couple of years.
Yeah, I wish I had a crystal ball. I don't. And I've been at my community college now for 30 years, including my part-time time. And we've been fighting the same fight, right? And each year it's, a mystery. We're just hearing now from our mayor of our city. So CUNY is funded both from the state of New York and also the city of New York. So it's a very complicated budget. But on the way, budget allocation is a political decision, right? yes, it's economics, but it's a political decision where we choose to put the funding. And I think the most important thing you said is the advocacy from our chancellors, from our college leadership. We need college presidents, chancellors, not to put you on the spot, Chancellor, but we need those folks fighting alongside us in the rooms that we don't get invited to remind the folks who are signing off on the budget how important these institutions are for the economic and the political good, the social good of our world, right? If we're educators, we believe in the mission, and it has to be funded. And yes, I don't equivocate in this book. Absolutely, we need more, because how do you get more full-time faculty and staff is budget. The austerity of the thin line, it's not working for anyone, and at some point it's just not going to work. I don't know, part of that crystal ball is we're also seeing a demographic shift in age of college students, right? It's just this trend now where the traditional college-age students is diminishing as a cohort nationally. Will that do anything? I don't know. I mean, I could imagine maybe it could open up, or will it close it even further because we're going to have fewer I don't know. But I do think we need a lot of alliances that bring together students and their families who depend on these institutions, and faculty. I mean, these are the discussions we should be having in our unions, in our faculty governance bodies, in our department meetings, and it kind of goes up along the chain. And I do think, I don't think at CUNY a lot of the college presidents see their role as advocating, and I think that that's to our peril.
Thank you.
I know that there are probably other questions, but I want to make sure that folks have these 10 minutes to use the bathroom, because at 10:30 we're going to have some morning workshops, and Robin is going to be leading a workshop that will involve more dialogue and invitation from you. And I will also say that the whole reason that we're reading her book is hopefully to pull ourselves together into spaces where we can keep talking about these things. And thank you for the good question, Ying. We are inheriting lots of policy and navigating lots of systems, but I hope that we have some voice and feel like there is a sense of power. And I feel like your book is an invitation to not just passively receive, right, and not allow our students to passively receive, but to activate ourselves and to activate our students. And so with that, thank you, and thank you to Gratitude for Dr. Robin Isserles.
Thank you.